Headlines screamed across the Farm Belt. U.S. beef sales to China collapsed to just 54 tons in a week, down from thousands. Another banner read, "China buys 12 million tons of soybeans from Brazil, bypassing America entirely." In coffee shops from Des Moines to Saskatoon, farmers and traders stared at the numbers and felt the ground shift beneath them. This wasn't a slow erosion, it was a cliff dive. In just days, decades of carefully built export markets seemed to unravel. The shockwaves rattled both sides of the border. For the United States, it looked like betrayal. For Canada, it looked like opportunity, but one wrapped in dangerous uncertainty. So how did nearly 9 out of 10 U.S. farm export dollars vanish from the world's busiest lanes almost overnight? And more importantly, can North America's breadbasket survive a storm this sudden, this brutal? For decades, the relationship looked unshakable. North America's farmland was a seamless system. Soybeans from Iowa rolling by barge down the Mississippi, beef cattle from Alberta feeding processors across the Midwest, and potato trucks crossing the US-Canada border without a second glance. On paper, it was a perfect marriage of scale and geography. American farmers leaned on vast acreage and high-volume yields. Canadian producers carved niches in quality and specialty markets. Together, they fed Asia, Europe, and each other, becoming symbols of agricultural abundance. For a time, tariffs were low, trust was high, and exports surged. But stability masked fragility. The first cracks appeared in 2018, when the US-China trade war sent soybean exports to China plunging 99% in a single month. That trauma lingered even as markets recovered. By 2024, new shadows loomed. A drought choking the Mississippi, a Panama Canal bottleneck raising freight costs, and whispers of new tariffs in Beijing. Farmers on both sides of the border began to sense that this wasn't simply a seasonal slump. It was a tectonic shift. The golden era of easy flows was over. A harsher, more uncertain phase had already begun. Washington's decision to double down on tariffs in early 2025 was pitched as tough love for global trade. On March 4, 2025, the United States announced 10 to 15% extra duties on a wide slate of Chinese agricultural imports, covering roughly $21 billion worth of goods. The White House insisted this was leverage, a way to force Beijing to the table over alleged intellectual property theft and unfair subsidies. For farmers, however, the logic felt painfully familiar. Sacrifice exports today in the hope of a stronger deal tomorrow. The policy collided with biology and geography. As planting season began in the Midwest, Chinese buyers quietly shifted to South America. They booked 8 million tons of soybeans in September and another 4 million in October from Brazil and Argentina, locking in cargoes during what had always been America's prime shipping window. Even when U.S. beans were offered at a discount, $40 per ton cheaper, they still sat on silos. Beijing's approximately 23% effective tariff wiped out the price advantage. Then came the beef shock. In mid-March, China let U.S. plant export registrations lapse. Within days, weekly beef sales to China collapsed from 2,000 tons to just 54 tons, a near wipeout. By April, a formal Chinese probe into U.S. beef imports was underway, chilling trade further. On paper, America had flexed. In reality, its farmers were watching their markets evaporate almost overnight. For Canadian producers, the U.S. stumble was both opportunity and risk. Ottawa moved swiftly to reassure partners that Canadian supply chains were open and reliable. Canadian beef had long struggled to gain market share in Asia against the juggernaut of U.S. exports. Suddenly, with American shipments throttled by paperwork and tariffs, Canadian exporters found buyers in Shanghai, Tokyo, and Seoul ready to talk. Statistics told the story. In 2024, China had imported a record 2.87 million metric tons of beef, but the first half of 2025 showed a 9.5% decline, a gap Canada was eager to fill. Prairie ranchers and processors pitched themselves as the premium North American supplier, leaning on Canada's reputation for food safety and quality control. For soybeans, the narrative was similar. When Chinese buyers bypassed the US, some diverted contracts toward Canadian shipments, particularly specialty soy suited for food processing. Yet Canada's optimism was shadowed by caution. Ottawa's own farm sector is tightly tied to US markets. Fertilizer flows, seed genetics, processing plants, and trucking all cross the border daily. If American farmers faltered too deeply, ripple effects would hit Canadian logistics, equipment sales, and even political goodwill. Moreover, Canada knew China's attention was fickle. Brazil remained the dominant supplier, and any Canadian gains could be temporary. Still, in coffee shops in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, the mood was strikingly different from Iowa or Nebraska. Canadian farmers spoke about stepping into the breach rather than losing the floor beneath us. The two nations, once partners in abundance, now faced diverging realities, one on the defensive, the other cautiously testing new ground. By mid-2025, both sides of the border found themselves trapped in a bind without easy exits. In Washington, officials extended a 90-day tariff truce with China on August 12th, a move hailed as preventing triple-digit escalations. But for farm exports, the reprieve rang hollow. Soybeans remained burdened by duties, beef exports were still throttled, and weekly USDA export reports showed dizzying collapses. Beef net sales down 73% in a single week. Soybean oil down 81%. Farmers saw no lifeline. In Ottawa, the picture was brighter on the surface but fragile underneath. Canadian gains in Asia risked provoking US retaliation, either through counter tariffs or renewed disputes over dairy and grain quotas. The fear was simple. What if Canada's opportunism today reignited trade wars tomorrow? Policy analysts warned that Canada cannot decouple from US agriculture without collateral damage. The deeper problem was structural. Global buyers were learning they could bypass North America altogether. Brazil, Argentina, and even Eastern Europe were stepping up, eroding the continent's status as a farm export powerhouse. For both US and Canadian farmers, that meant uncertainty wasn't just a season, it was the new climate. The fracture had become undeniable. What began as paperwork lapses and tariff tit-for-tats had crystallized into a reordering of trade itself. North America, once a symbol of agricultural stability, now looked more like a battlefield where allies tread uneasily and adversaries exploit every weakness. In the United States, the consequences landed hard and fast. By late March, when beef sales to China plunged from 2,000 tons to just 54 tons in a week, Midwestern producers felt abandoned. USDA's weekly export reports painted a grim picture. Marketing year lows for beef, soybean oil exports collapsing more than 80% in a single week. What had been steady business evaporated almost overnight. Take the case of Greater Omaha Packing, one of the country's major beef processors. Much of its expansion in the past decade hinged on steady access to Asian markets. With registrations lapsed and Chinese buyers stepping back, shipments stalled. The company had to idle shifts temporarily, sending workers home. Local economies that relied on plant wages, from Nebraska diners to trucking companies, suddenly faced thinner margins. Soybean growers, too, saw a collapse in confidence. Elevators in Iowa and Illinois filled with beans as China snapped up Brazilian cargoes. Farmers pointed out bitterly that even when US beans were $40 per ton cheaper, Beijing's 23% effective duty made them unattractive. Many recalled 2018 when soybean exports to China dropped 99% in October and 100% in November. The fear was palpable. History was repeating itself. Consumers weren't spared. Domestic prices for certain meat cuts rose as export channels narrowed, pushing supermarkets to reshuffle supplies. Feed costs also fluctuated, affecting everything from poultry to dairy. One Missouri hog producer described the situation as paying more to raise animals, selling them for less, and watching the world buy somewhere else. The shared cost was not abstract. It was lived daily. From small towns in Kansas to boardrooms in Toronto, the collapse of U.S. exports was never a one-country tragedy. It was a continental wound, exposing how deeply intertwined the agricultural economies of America and Canada had become. North America now stands at a precarious crossroads. On one side lies the memory of seamless trade, grain barges flowing down the Mississippi, beef shipments moving freely across borders, and soybeans feeding the world. On the other lies a fractured reality, tariffs, paperwork, and rival suppliers ready to seize every lost ton. Neither the United States nor Canada can easily retreat, yet neither can move forward without risk. For farmers, the question is existential. Will this continent remain the breadbasket of the world or become a casualty of global power plays? The answers aren't clear, but one truth is, both nations are bound together in this storm. The real question is, will they weather it side by side or apart? Like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe.